Good day and salutations. Today is Tuesday. Today for the North American friends is the reset. We are getting into a new week, and then tomorrow for us European Chads, the reset is going to come in. So we are going to take a recap of what happened this week in both raids and Mythic Plus when it comes to the popularity, the representation, the performance of the specs in both of the high-end PvE activities you can do, starting with the round of applause of congratulations for the World First kill, acquired by Echo on Sylvanas, beating again after like 2 tiers. So EU wins again, but you know, that's something that touches a very small portion of the population. So let's go back to some more broad points that are going to interest more of the player base, starting with Mythic Plus, because we left Mythic Plus behind for a while, right? We let the numbers swell up, we let people getting more and more logs and data into the Mythic Plus keys. Last week, when we checked into this, the few days into the first week of this season, back when the item level was still capped and whatnot, we had roughly a half to a third of the numbers we have right now. Starting to look at tanks, for example, we had, for the first time, actually, we were very close last week, very close, but not quite. This time, though, we have the first official takeover of Vengeance Demon Hunter. I foresaw this last week, that eventually this was going to happen. Guardian Druid is now the most popular tank at keys higher than 15, which is still somewhat early to look at keys higher than 20, because just 21s and 22s are getting cleared now with the whole rescaling of Mythic Plus level. So we're just gonna have to wait a while before the keys go up again like they did in the first season of Shadowlands. So Guardian is now the most represented tank in Mythic Plus. You might have seen this yourself, of course. If you have played Mythic Plus these couple of weeks, you have seen way more, I guess, way more non-Vengeance Demon Hunter tanks. You know, even if you have watched my videos where I throw in some random Mythic Plus keys, I have in fact seen more Guardian Druids and Brewmaster Monks and even Prot Paladins than I have seen Vengeance Demon Hunters. Of course, as a result, and we will see this when it comes to melee DPS, there are going to be more Havoc Demon Hunters, which kind of answers the question as to why Vengeance is not being as played anymore. It will be interesting to see how this progresses, because we know there is always some kind of connection between specs that are popular in Raid and specs that become popular in Mythic Plus. Very often, one spec that becomes very meta in Raid encounters is going to spill over in Mythic Plus, because that's what all people are playing in Raid. So when they go and try to do Mythic Plus, that's the spec they want to play as. So in this case, for example, Guardian has grown to be more popular in Mythic Plus, but we will see that it's not that in Raid encounters Guardian is now a popular tank, yet it is rising in Mythic Plus. The other question could be, for example, other tanks growing in population and popularity in Raid encounters, not really getting more represented in Mythic Plus, like Blood Death Knight and Brewmaster Monk, for example. Then over to the one that changed the least. So we're gonna take the least amount of time going over this because it's been nearly unchanged. This is the healers. Same as the last few weeks, and also same as the end of Season 1, where Restoration Shaman does stay as the most popular healer overall, with Holy Paladin being popular, but also being more popular than Restoration Shaman when it comes to the very highest of keys, due to their damage, the damage they can bring. Yes, of course, this was expected and shocked nobody. The nerfs to the damage of Holy Paladin did absolutely nothing. When you do 3 times as much damage as any other healer, getting nerfed by 10 to 18% is going to solve absolutely nothing. You're still going to be the healer being brought if you need damage. So that's just gonna stay a thing. And yes, in case you're wondering, the higher of the two when it comes to priests is still Holy. Holy Priest has passed a while ago. It has passed Discipline Priest. We mentioned they were almost twice as much played compared to Discipline. Now they are even over twice as much played than Discipline Priest. Another situation which did not change as much is the melee DPS. What we have looked last week has remained roughly the same, with the sad news that Havoc Demon Hunter was now the more popular melee DPS spec. I wouldn't brag too much about this call because it was very obvious. The moment Vengeance is going to lose popularity, Havoc was going to skyrocket. Remember how popular Havoc has been in Legion and how popular Havoc has been in BFA, while at the same time Vengeance barely ever being a used tank for the last couple of expansions. It was just Havoc. So the moment Havoc was supposedly kind of bad. This first season of Shadowlands, many people just rerolled to Vengeance with no issues. They just migrated to tank. The moment Havoc gains a little bit more strength compared to before, the moment they get buffed a little bit, every Vengeance Demon Hunter, every fake Vengeance Demon Hunter, which was a Havoc in disguise, just goes back to Havoc, and Havoc becomes the more popular again. The slight minor addition is that we see almost twice as many Arms Warriors as before, right? This also could be due to what we're about to see in raids. The fact that for a while now, Arms has performed better than Fury and has been more popular even at the highest level. If you looked at the world first guilds, Arms is the warrior spec being played. As a result, Mythic Plus is using way more Arms warriors. They are still something like a third of Fury. They are still much lower than Fury, but you can see that even just looking at those specs being used in World First Race for raiding can have an effect in the Mythic Plus choices that people do. No real major change for the other specs. We also have roughly a confirmation of what we have seen last week when it comes to ranged. It is continuing to have Elemental Shaman rise a lot in representation, with much lower representation of Marksmanship Hunters compared to the previous season. The Mage has completed the shift from Fire to Frost, as well as Warlocks now being Destruction. So you have this high representation now at a similar level of Marksmanship, Elemental, Frost, Destruction, and Balance. Even when you look at the colors, you can see that it's much more bright and varied compared to Season 1. When you look at the high keys in Season 1, it was almost always light blue and orange, because Mage, Fire Mage, and Balanced Druid were everywhere, and then the last one was usually your melee DPS of choice, like the Rogue. Now you can see there is much more option. You can see the Hunters, but also Windwalker Monks, Elemental Shamans, Demon Hunters are back, Rogues are still there, Warriors have shown up, much more varied at the very least. So the main changes for Mythic Plus for now remain the same, which is no real change when it comes to healers, way more Guardian Druids, but in general, way more tanks. Even when we go and look at the color of the tanks in high keys, you can see it's way more different and varied than we had at the start of Season 1 with just Vengeance, basically. And then for melee, it's mostly Havoc and Fury Warrior rising, and for range DPS, it's Elemental Shaman and the two new rerolls of Mage and Warlock, Frost and Destruction. It's worth mentioning for Mythic Plus, before we move over to the raid part, it's worth mentioning that many of these choices are still in the trial phase, in the trial and error. People are still trying. They're still more willing to test things out, because it's the first few weeks. People want score from Mythic Plus. They see multiple options and multiple picks. They're not sure which is the absolute strongest, so they are more willing to just try out multiple picks. It is likely that as the weeks go by, as the keys are going to become higher and people are trying to push higher, that we are going to settle for more, more specific picks. Right now, as I just showed, it's common to see 5 different tank specs at the high keys. But in a few weeks, it's likely that it's going to be decided by the community, decided by the meta, by the high players especially, that no, actually, you know what, Brewmaster is the best. So eventually, over time, more and more high groups, high key level groups are going to just go for Brewmaster, and it's going to become the most used tank. Maybe even similar to what we had Vengeance in the first season. Same goes for DPS. Right now, it seems like a communist utopia where everyone gets the same equal share of picks in Mythic Plus, but eventually you are bound to see, no, actually this is the best composition, it's the best possible result with these 3 picks, and eventually some other specs are going to be bound to be played much less than what you're seeing right now. So what you will see in the next few weeks is likely to be not as diverse and varied as what you have had in the first few weeks of the season. Now, we are moving over to the raid. Now, the first thing to look at when it comes to the raid is, of course, the numbers. How has it been so far? The popularity has gotten some slight additions. This is pretty interesting to see because, again, this might have been the result of high-end guilds choosing their picks and the other guilds lower down, basically copying what they were doing. We ended last week in Heroic, where the popularity compared to the first week of Mythic has remained very similar at the top. it's still Balanced Druid, it's still Destruction Warlock, Marksmanship Hunter, Frost Mage, Shadow Priest, Havoc at the top, just like the top 6 of Mythic progression right now. That's the same. Even at the bottom, you know, Fire Mage, Affliction, Survival, Frost Decay. The only minor change is Outlaw Rogue being played way more in Heroic than it is in Mythic, because of course Heroic probably also has more presence of Mythic Plus players being Outlaw, staying Outlaw for the raid, but then actual Mythic Raiders won't likely be staying Outlaw for raid progression, so they will go either Assassination or Subtlety. The main change is of course Arms Warrior. As you can see, in Heroic, most of the warriors started confident of Fury, that Fury would have been the better one. They went in, it was actually the second most represented spec for melee DPS in Heroic in the first week, and then as Mythic starts, you have this slow overtaking of Arms Warrior. This has to be impacted also by the fact that world first race guilds were just using Arms Warriors, not Fury Warriors. So down the line, all of the other, so to speak, normal guilds just said, well, you know, if they are using an Arms Warrior, why shouldn't we use an Arms Warrior instead of a Fury one? So despite the Heroic week having almost 5 times as many Fury Warrior than Arms ones, getting into the first week of Mythic, Arms has already overtaken Fury. It is worth mentioning slightly that Fury did not have their best in slot legendary in the week of Heroic and the first, I guess, couple of days of Mythic, and also that Arms Warriors are one of the few, talking about the high-end Mythic progression guilds, one of the few that can benefit greatly from Wind Fury Totem of Enhancement Shamans. It's almost a 10% damage increase. It's like a best in slot legendary from Legion, the power of Wind Fury for an Arms Warrior. So they get empowered greatly to the point that the current world first guild, Echo, killed Sylvanas with triple Arms Warriors in a group with an Enhancement Shaman giving them Wind Fury Totem. As for the rest of the representation, it seems about the same. It shouldn't be changed based on what you have seen in high-end guilds. High-end guilds that you have seen in streams in the last days have not particularly used many mages, for example. They have not used many Shadow Priests, they have not used many Elemental Shamans or many Hunters. It was primarily, mostly, Balanced Druids and Warlocks when it came to ranged representation. But that is, generally speaking, you know, an extremization of the picks you can have when you're trying to push as much and as high as possible. Now, looking at the damage numbers is also very risky because, as we will mention in the amount of kills we have had, basically we only have logs for the first 3 bosses. We don't have that many logs available, and even the few that are available for the further bosses are not even public, so it's not that you have much data to look for. So it's just Taragru, Eye of the Jailer, and the 9, which means the damage profile of these bosses are going to be reflected in the performance of this damage meter. For example, Affliction Warlocks. All of a sudden, from being at the bottom in the Heroic week and being very lowly represented in terms of popularity, they are at the top. Why? Because Eye of the Jailer has some pretty good multi-dotting on the ad that spawns, because the 9 has some pretty good multi-dotting, consistent to target multi-dotting on the 2 mini-bosses, as well as the ad spawning, so Affliction Warlocks can do very well there. Meanwhile, specs that are not particularly good on 2-target fights, like Elemental Shaman, like Balanced Druid, like Arcane Mage, and Marksmanship Hunter as well, they are not doing as hot. So when you look at this and you're like, wait a second, I've looked at the world first kills and I saw a ton of Balanced Druids, and here they are at the absolute bottom. In the world first kill, I've even seen Enhancement Shamans and Unholy DKs and Marksmanship Hunters being in the group, and they are all at the bottom. Yes, because most of these numbers are for the first 3 bosses only. The more bosses we get, the more these are going to continue to swindle, depending on the damage profile of the boss. As soon as you get a heavy AoE boss fight, you will see the overall numbers having AoE heavy specs growing much more in representation, and then guilds will go through progressing maybe 2 to 3 back-to-back single target bosses, so all of the single target specs will keep growing and growing, etc, etc, etc. So for now, most of this damage outlook is mostly irrelevant. You shouldn't take too much from this. What we have skipped over was the popularity of the healers, mostly because it has remained exactly the same. It's Restoration Shaman, the most popular, followed by Holy Paladin pretty closely, and then behind those two, we have the drop with the rest of the specs. It is worth mentioning again that the highest level of guilds have eventually decided to go for Holy Paladin and Discipline Priest, like what we have seen a couple of days ago. Most of them were just stacking those two. We have already underlined the issues or the problems that those two specs can bring. For the majority of the player base, though, it shouldn't change too much in terms of representation. What is more interesting is the tanks, right? The tanks still show that Brewmaster is the more popular one and that Vengeance Demon Hunter is still there. It is nowhere near as dominant as it was at the end of the last season. Blood DK, for example, is much closer now to Vengeance Demon Hunter. And just like we pointed out when you looked at the popularity a few days into this week, Protection Paladin was being used by many guilds fighting for World First, and yet continues to be very lowly played by the rest of the guilds, as an example. And the same goes for Vengeance. Vengeance is still kind of popular, but not many guilds are using it at the high level, so it's bound eventually to just deflate in popularity over time. Now, besides looking at the actual numbers of the specs and their popularity and their performance in the raid, what about the actual progression? So after the first week, roughly about now, some numbers are going to change slightly, but up to this point, these were the numbers that we have had in terms of kills. So, a lot of people went through the Taragru, and then Eye of the Jailer and the 9 have a very close kill relation. So, 845 guilds killed the Eye, and out of those 845, 600 killed the 9, right? So it's basically almost 80% of all the guilds who killed the Eye were able to kill the 9, but then 600 guilds killed the 9, but only 78 killed Remnant of Ner'zhul. So 15% of guilds who killed the 9 were able to kill Remnant of Ner'zhul. So it's a much bigger block, right? It's a much bigger cock block compared to the difference between the Eye and the 9 kills. The real question is, how does it compare? How does it compare to the last tier, Castellnatria? How much faster or slower was this at the end of the week? Because initially, you might get baited to thinking it's actually faster. Because in the first week of Castellnatria, roughly 340 guilds killed Hungering Destroyer, the third boss you had to kill. Meanwhile, now, over 600 guilds killed the 9. Also, in EU, at the very least, you still have this Tuesday night in terms of kills, so it's bound to go even higher. Not many guilds raid on Tuesday, but a decent amount to make this number go higher, so it's likely you will get twice as many guilds killing the 9 compared to the guilds that killed Hungering Destroyer. So what's the question? Are there twice as many guilds raiding now than they had before? Or is the 9 twice as easy as Hungering Destroyer? The answer is likely neither. They are probably at a similar level, it's just that more guilds possibly, and this is something that might come into play, had more trouble, for example, killing Heroic Sylvanas or re-clearing Heroic, which was harder tuned at the very least, than Heroic Castellnatria, so you lost more time having to do Heroic. The other point is that even though over 600 guilds killed the 9, only 78 killed Remnant of Ner'zhul. Basically 80 or so managed to kill the fourth boss. And this is very peculiar, because out of the 340 guilds that killed Destroyer, in the first week of Castellnatria you had 60 guilds killing Inerva, you had 110 guilds killing Zymox, and then you had 140 guilds killing Sanctum Salvation fight. So right now, of the 600 guilds at 3 kills, only 80 of them were able to kill the fourth boss, but in Castellnatria, even though you had a much smaller number of guilds, 340, killing the third boss, you had over 300 of them being able to kill a fourth boss. Remember that in Castellnatria, it was up to you, the boss order. After Hungering Destroyer, some guilds went Inerva, some guilds went Zymox, some guilds went the Kel'Thas fight. So you have this interesting situation in terms of boss kills where, yes, the 9 and killing the first 3 bosses has been easier than defeating Hungering Destroyer back in Castellnatria, but the fourth boss of this raid of Sanctum of Domination is proving much harder than any of the fourth bosses you could have chosen in Castellnatria, Inerva, Sanctum Salvation, or Zymox. That is quite interesting. It seems like, at least from the way they have been designed and tuned, that the middle of the boss fights in Sanctum of Domination is much harder than the middle of Castellnatria. Remnant of Ner'zhul, Soul Render Dormazein, and Pain Myth Raznal compared to Inerva, Sanctum Salvation, and Zymox. They seem to be considerably harder than the Castanatria bosses. So that is why there seems to be this weird situation with boss kills so far in Sanctum of Domination. I think that's a pretty important distinction. It's going to be a very drastic difference compared to Castanatria. The seemingly much harder difficulty level of the middle of the pack bosses compared to what we had in Castanatria, especially considering how seemingly undertuned Kel'Thuzad and Sylvanas are. If we just go by the standards of top guilds, Kel'Thuzad dying in 20 or so pulls as a second to last boss compared to, for example, Stone Legion, it's a completely different world. Yes, of course, Kel'Thuzad was technically being cheesed, and the cheese has now been fixed, so it should be a little bit harder now. But even Sylvanas taking, for example, half the number of wipes of Jaina, for example, and dying before the first reset, for example. It does seem like in this tier you're going to have a much higher consistent difficulty from Remnant of Ner'zhul going all the way down to the later bosses, as opposed to what we had in Castanatria, where the difficulty up and before Council of Blood was much lower than what you would have gotten for the last bosses. So some people might enjoy this, some people might not. Some people like having or knowing that the later bosses are going to be the harder bosses and the earlier bosses are going to be a little bit easier. Others are going to enjoy it more, knowing that the level of difficulty of the bosses is going to stay roughly the same, or it's not going to be that big of a jump in difficulty when you go from one boss to the next. So it's up to preference, really, whichever one you prefer of the two. Now, after going through this, we can stop. We can take a break. We have gone over this first week of the full release of the season. Last week we had no Mythic Raiding and we had no fully unlocked Mythic Plus with its 236 item level rewards that we have gotten this week. And we've also gotten both weeks in terms of affixes. We have gotten Tyrannical and now we have gotten Fortified. So let me guys know what you think particularly about the Mythic Plus season, since now you have been able to experience both major affixes in 2 different weeks, as well as how have you felt the difficulty of this raid compared to Castanatria, at the very least for the progression in Heroic for most of the bosses compared to Castanatria. We will continue updating this data as we go through the weeks and we get different changes, hotfixes and possible balance tuning now that the World First Race is over. In the next few days or possibly couple of weeks, it's likely that Blizzard might put in some changes to specs. They have done this quite often as soon as the World First Race was over, so it might happen this time as well. Thank you guys for watching the video. If you have enjoyed it and you want to support the channel, you should probably just enable autoplay and just watch my videos on repeat, muting the browser page, minimizing it and just letting it run in the background. That will help. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, now, my dear Windows forecast tool, yesterday you said probably rain. Why then is it 34 degrees right now, Mr. Forecast?